Hello, today we are going to be looking at vicarious liability AO1. So first of all, vicarious liability is where a third party has legal responsibility for the unlawful actions of another. So in this context, what we are looking at is an employer is liable for the torts or actions of their employee. Now, the person who commits the wrongdoing, so the employee, is called the tortfeasor. So the wrongdoer, basically. So you can refer to the employee, but remember in this situation, you have got the defendant, who is the employer. You've got the claimant, the person who's been injured or harmed or their property has been damaged. And then you've got this third person, the person who actually does the wrong thing, the employee, and they are referred to as the tortfeasor. So the second point is more than one party or employer can be liable, and that's via systems. The burden of proof is on the claimant to prove vicarious liability on the balance of probabilities. Now, there are three, we can divide vicarious liability into three. Is the person employed? Was it in the course of their employment? And is the close connection test satisfied? So, element one, the tortfeasor must be an employee. So you have to decide, was the person who did the wrong thing, were they employed? And there are some basic tests to establish this point. So first of all, you've got the control test. Was the employer in control of the employee? I think this is quite an old bit of law because they talk about the master and the servant, but you can just say control test, was the employer in control of the employee? So the more control they have, the more likely the person is to be employed. So the case of Hawley was to do with the bouncer, and the club did employ the bouncer. Mersey docks, this is the idea of you and your equipment. If you are hired out to somebody else, the new person is your employer. But if you and your equipment go somewhere else, then the original firm that you're at, they are the employer. And the reason is it's harder to control you and your equipment. So it would be unfair to make the new firm responsible. So just remember, it's just a small distinction, but you by yourself, new firm is responsible. You and your equipment, old firm is responsible. And that's Mersey docks. The second test that you can look at to see if the person was employed is what we call the integration test. And Stevenson just said the person is employed if they are integrated into the business. So the bigger the role you play in the business, then the more likely you are to be employed. And then the next test is what we call the economic test. So you have to look at factors such as pay, uniforms, tax. And, if you have a contract, if you have holiday pay, then you are likely to be employed. So that was the case of ready mixed concrete. Now, in modern times, the courts just tend to consider if, and this is a very important phrase, always write this down, if it is akin to employment. So what they're basically saying is if it's akin, if it's similar to, if it looks like employment, then it probably is employment. So they have a common sense approach to this. Case examples for you, the case of Cox, the prisoner was employed by the Ministry of Justice, so not a traditional employment situation, but in the kitchen they were doing work, in prison, so they were employed. And a very recent case is the Barclays Bank case, Supreme Court decision in 2020. A doctor was hired to do pre-employment health checks on people who were about to start a job. But this doctor sexually assaulted the victims, and the Supreme Court in 2020 held that Barclays were not vicariously liable because the doctor was an independent contractor. Okay, so element one, are you employed? Element two, was the activity in the course of employment? So things that do count as in the course of employment, if you go against orders, limpus, that's our racing bus driver, acting negligently, Century Insurance, so cigarette in a petrol forecourt, the employers were liable for the damage caused, and even committing a crime, so that's the case of Morrison's, where he punched a customer, so Morrison's were vicariously liable, and also where the employer benefits from the tort, so the case of Rose. Circumstances that are not in the course of employment, not all crimes are. So, for example, the case of N, which is where a police officer raped the victim, a drunk girl that he picked up outside a club, that is not in the course of his employment. Therefore, the chief constable was not vicariously liable. And then the really important one, acting on a frolic of your own, the case of Hilton. So if you do something completely unexpected, completely outside the course of your employment, it's called acting on a frolic of your own, and your employer will not be vicariously liable. Similarly, if you give unauthorised lifts, as in the case of Twine, then they are not vicariously liable. And then finally, element 3, there must be a close connection between what the person is employed to do and their conduct. So here you need to look at the nature of their job. And Morrison's is the case that you can quote again. Morrison's was saying, well, he was at work, so he was at a Morrison's store. He was in his employment. It was during a work shift when he punched a customer, and they said there is a close connection between what he is employed to do and his conduct. And then just as a very final point, you could talk about remedies. People are going to be seeking damages. So it could be pecuniary, where it's easy to put a financial amount on for like loss of earnings or damage to a car, and then non-pecuniary damages. So these are damages for your pain and suffering. So that is the AO1 for vicarious liability. Tune in now for the AO3.